I've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on my children, yet I've never received a single word of thanks. But when my little dog fell ill, and I spent $500 to save him, it was my own son and daughter-in-law who threw us out into the street. They spat in my face, calling me a useless old woman, a burden to feed. I swallowed that humiliation. But there's one secret they have no idea about. Before I tell you the rest, hit subscribe, give a like, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Trust me, you won't want to miss the ending. I still remember the house we once called our home, the one my late husband and I worked for decades to build. Every brick, every coat of paint, every piece of furniture carried the weight of our sweat and hopes. It was not just a building, but the place where we raised our son, celebrated birthdays, and held each other close during storms. That house was valued at $320,000, but to me its worth could not be measured in money. It was the embodiment of our life's work. When my son and his wife came to me, their voices trembling with urgency, I did not see manipulation. I saw family reaching out. They said they were tired of renting, that they wanted stability, a place where they could finally settle down. My son looked at me with pleading eyes, and she clasped my hand as if I was the only answer to their struggles. My heart softened, as it always did when it came to him. I told myself this was what any mother would do. What good was holding on to a house if it could give my child a chance at a better life? I convinced myself that my late husband would have wanted this too. So I signed the papers, sold the house, and handed them the money. It felt like passing on a piece of myself, but I did it willingly, because I believed in their gratitude, in their promises. They welcomed me into their new home with open arms. For a while it felt like the sacrifice had been worth it. They called me their savior, their miracle. My son said he would take care of me for the rest of my days. His wife assured me I would never feel lonely, that this house would always have a place for me. In those early days, I allowed myself to believe them. I sat at their table, laughed at their stories, and even felt a quiet pride that I had helped create this comfort. At night, lying in the guest room they had prepared, I would whisper to myself that everything had turned out just as it should, that maybe I had not lost a home, but gained a deeper bond with my family. For a fleeting time, I felt safe, as if love had been returned to me in equal measure. Yet even then, a small voice inside me questioned if trust alone could hold everything together. At first I told myself the changes were small, hardly worth noticing, but they grew like cracks in a wall, widening each day. My son began spending more and more evenings glued to the television, shouting at the screen during football games, placing bets with a confidence that chilled me. I overheard the phone calls, the exchanges of numbers, the bursts of laughter followed by curses. Thousands of dollars slipped through his hands as if money had no weight. I wanted to speak, to remind him how hard his father and I had worked to build something solid, but every time I opened my mouth he dismissed me with a wave of his hand. I thought maybe I could ignore it, focus on small joys like arranging flowers or preparing meals. Yet even those little comforts became reasons for conflict. When I came home with a bouquet of fresh roses, he frowned and muttered that I wasted money. If I bought a basket of fruit or a few special ingredients for dinner, he accused me of being careless, of not respecting his sacrifices. I looked at him and wondered how the boy I raised, the boy who once brought me wildflowers from the yard, had become so quick to call me a burden. His wife, too, changed. In the beginning she called me mother, touched my arm gently, and told me I made the house warmer. But as weeks turned into months, her sweetness faded. She avoided me in the kitchen, answered my questions with short replies, and sighed whenever I lingered too long in the living room. Sometimes I caught her glancing at me with impatience, as though my very presence unsettled the air. The warmth that once wrapped around us like a blanket now dissolved into silence so heavy I could almost taste it. At dinner, conversations dwindled. They spoke to each other in hurried whispers while I sat quietly, pretending to focus on the food. My laughter, once welcomed, now seemed out of place. I noticed how their plans never included me, how their evenings grew busier, how the space between us stretched wider with every passing day. One night, sitting alone in my room, I realized the truth I had tried to avoid. I was no longer the savior they celebrated, no longer the guest they promised to cherish. I had become invisible, an old shadow in their home. My chest ached with the weight of that knowledge. I wanted to believe love could survive, that gratitude could last, but their eyes told me otherwise. It happened on an ordinary afternoon at the supermarket, a place that once felt so simple and harmless. I was walking beside my daughter-in-law, pushing the cart slowly, picking out a few things I thought would brighten the house. A small bouquet of lilies, some fresh apples, and a loaf of bread that reminded me of the kind my husband used to love. I held them carefully, thinking they were nothing extravagant. But then her voice cut through the air, sharp and deliberate, rising louder than it needed to be. "Don't let her choose," she said. "She always spends too much." The words pierced me before I could even react. Heads turned. Strangers glanced at me with quick eyes full of curiosity and judgment. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, my chest tightening as if I had been caught doing something shameful. I wanted to sink into the floor, to vanish between the aisles of cereal and canned goods. I looked at my son, who stood only a few steps away. For a moment I begged silently for him to say something, anything, to show that I was not alone in this humiliation. But he did not. He kept his eyes fixed on the shelves, his lips pressed into a thin line, his silence heavier than any insult. In that moment I realized how much louder silence can be than words. Her scorn hurt me, but his refusal to defend me cut deeper, like a betrayal I had never imagined possible. My hands trembled as I placed the lilies back on the display. I pretended to adjust my scarf, to occupy myself so the others in the aisle might believe I did not hear. But I heard every syllable, echoing in my head. The sound of people shifting around us, the quiet coughs, the awkward avoidance of my eyes only deepened the shame. In that cold house where silence often replaced kindness, there was one light that never dimmed. My grandson Alex, only 8 years old, carried a heart bigger than his small frame. Whenever I felt invisible, brushed aside by the adults, Alex would run into my arms as if he knew I needed to be reminded I still mattered. He wrapped his little arms around my waist, pressing his cheek against me, and in those embraces I found the warmth I thought I had lost forever. Alex had a bond with our Yorkie that was as pure as his laughter. The small dog followed him everywhere, its tail wagging with a joy that seemed untouched by the coldness in the air. I often watched them play together in the living room, Alex whispering secrets into the dog's soft fur, as if the little creature was his truest friend. Sometimes he would tug gently at my sleeve, asking me to join them, and together we created a small island of peace that shielded us from the tension around us. One evening, after another meal where his parents ignored my presence, Alex climbed into my lap and spoke in a hushed, serious tone that surprised me. He said he would protect me and the dog, that no one would hurt us as long as he was there. My eyes filled with tears I dared not let fall. I stroked his hair, kissed the top of his head, and whispered back that he was my brave boy, my guardian. In that moment, it was not me comforting him, but him saving me from despair. Nights were easier because of him. When the house grew too heavy with unspoken resentment, I could hear Alex's soft laughter echoing down the hallway, the dog's paws tapping against the wooden floor, and I knew I was not entirely alone. I clung to those sounds as if they were proof that love still lived under that roof. In the chill of rejection, Alex's tenderness and the loyalty of a small dog became my anchor. They reminded me that kindness does not vanish just because others choose cruelty. They gave me strength to rise each morning, to hold on to hope, even when the walls around me seemed determined to close in. I thought of all the years I had spent sacrificing, giving, believing that love within a family would protect me from this kind of cruelty. Instead, I found myself exposed, judged, stripped of dignity in the middle of a grocery store. It was not the money, not the flowers, not the food. It was the way my existence was reduced to a burden in public view. That night, The scene replayed in my mind again and again. The bouquet of lilies I could not buy, the stranger's stares, my son's silence. And I understood, perhaps more clearly than ever before, that love unspoken can vanish as quickly as it is needed most. There were many times I reached into the little savings I had kept hidden, money I told myself was for emergencies, and spent it quietly. I bought medicine when Alex had a cough, small clothes when he outgrew his old ones, fresh flowers to remind myself that beauty still belonged in a home. I never asked for thanks. It was enough for me to see him smile, to know that his needs were met even if no one else seemed to notice. When my daughter-in-law was too busy, I would take the bus to the supermarket alone. I filled the cart with vegetables, milk, bread, and whatever else the family might need. Back at the house, I unpacked the bags in silence, stocking the refrigerator until it was full, arranging the pantry so nothing would be missing. I told myself this was how I could still be useful, how I could earn a place in their lives. They ate the food without question, as if it appeared by magic. Plates piled with fruit, dinners made richer by cuts of meat I had chosen with care, sweets that softened the bitterness of long days. Not once did they ask where it came from. Not once did they consider that the money might not have been theirs. Their silence was not gratitude, but indifference, and that indifference cut deeper than any harsh word. Sometimes, when they did notice, it was only to scold. If they saw salmon in the basket, or imported grapes, or a box of pastries, they called it wasteful. My son would shake his head, his voice sharp with reproach, as if I had betrayed him by choosing something finer. His wife would sigh loudly, muttering that I spent without thought. I wanted to tell them that I had spent my own savings, that I denied myself in order to give them something better, but the words never left my mouth. My pride held them back, and so I bore the sting of their criticism in silence. At night I lay awake, thinking of the years I had scrimped and saved, the sacrifices made to set aside even that small amount. To see it vanish, not with appreciation but with contempt, left me hollow. Still, when morning came, I rose and did it all again, because I did not know how to stop giving, even to those who no longer cared to see. One afternoon, our little Yorkie slipped out into the yard, full of energy as always. I heard a sudden yelp, sharp and desperate, and when I rushed outside, I saw him struggling near a pile of wood. A heavy board had caught his small paw. His tiny body shook, and he whimpered in pain, refusing even the touch of his favorite toy. My heart clenched as I lifted him into my arms, his eyes wide and wet, his trust resting entirely in me. I carried him straight to the veterinarian, my hands trembling the entire drive. The doctor examined him gently and said the paw was bruised, swollen, but not broken. He needed treatment, rest, and medicine. The bill came to $500. I did not hesitate. I opened my purse and paid with the savings I had left, knowing it was the only choice I could make. Love has no price when the creature you love looks at you as though you are his only comfort. I did not tell my son or his wife. I feared the anger, the accusations of wasting money. So I kept the secret close, carrying the little bag of medicine in my coat pocket, tucking the receipt deep into my drawer. At night, when the house was quiet, I sat with Yorkie on my lap, carefully cleaning his paw, wrapping it with fresh bandages, whispering to him that he was safe. His small body relaxed in my arms, his eyes slowly closing, and in that moment I felt the purest form of gratitude, but secrets rarely stay hidden. One evening my daughter-in-law stormed into my room, waving the receipt she had found. Her voice cut sharp, accusing me of being reckless, of throwing away money on a dog. I stood there in silence, holding the little one against me as though shielding him from her words. Each accusation sliced deeper than the last. She saw only the number on the bill, never the life trembling in my arms. That night, long after her anger had passed, I returned to my chair with Yorkie. I unwound the bandage, replaced it carefully, and stroked his fur until he drifted back to sleep. The moonlight through the window touched us both, and I realized that even if no one in the house cared, I could still give love where it was needed. Perhaps that was my purpose now, to guard what small lives depended on me. In that quiet moment, with the soft sound of his breathing, I felt the weight of loneliness ease, if only a little. That morning I decided enough was enough. The pantry was empty, the refrigerator nearly bare, and no one else seemed to care. So I took the bus into the city and walked through the aisles of the big supermarket. I filled the cart carefully with everything the family needed for the week: vegetables, milk, bread, meat, fruit, and small treats for Alex, who had been so patient with the coldness of the house. By the time I reached the cashier, the total stood at $700. My heart sank as I handed over my card, but I told myself it was not just for me. It was for all of us. When I returned home, I set the bags on the counter and stacked the refrigerator until it was full once more. For the first time, I decided to be firm. I laid the long receipt on the table and called for my daughter-in-law. My voice did not tremble as I told her the truth, that I had spent my savings too many times already, and this time I wanted her to reimburse me. Her laughter came quick and sharp, echoing through the kitchen like broken glass. She called me wasteful, foolish, as though filling the shelves with food was some kind of sin. Then her words cut deeper, darker. She sneered that the dog should be thrown out onto the street, that he cost too much, that my care for him was nothing but vanity. And then, with a look of cold triumph, she spat that I was nothing but a burden, living off them while pretending to give. I stood frozen, each word striking harder than a slap. I glanced toward my son, but as before he offered nothing, not even a whisper in my defense. Alex stood in the hallway, eyes wide, clutching the dog in his small arms, his face pale with confusion. That evening the house grew heavier than ever. My daughter-in-law did not cook, leaving pots and pans untouched. Alex went to bed without dinner, his stomach empty, his spirit heavy. I sat alone in my room, hearing the echo of her words again and again. The fullness of the refrigerator could not hide the emptiness in our home. It was as though love itself had been banished, leaving only silence and resentment in its place. The house seemed to hold its breath the afternoon my son came home from work, the air sharp with tension like the seconds before a storm. I had been in the kitchen folding a towel, trying to make the world ordinary for a moment, when their voices rose in the living room and then spilled into the hallway. I heard my daughter-in-law complain about expenses, and the word choke came through like a knife. And before I could step forward, my son appeared in the doorway, his face red and tight with something I could not name. He did not ask, he did not listen, he only lashed out. In a motion so cruel that it felt unreal, he grabbed the little Yorkie and flung him through the door into the yard, as if the dog were nothing more than trash to be tossed aside. The sound of the tiny body hitting the grass was a blow to my chest. Alex screamed like I had never heard him scream, a raw animal sound that broke me open, and he ran out and threw himself over the small form and wrapped his arms around the dog as if he could hold the world together with his hug. I moved without thinking and pulled my grandson into my arms, holding him as he sobbed. And when I looked up, my son was standing over us, jaw clenched, venom in his voice as he insulted me in front of my child. He called me names that cut like stones. He accused me of being a burden and of living off them like a parasite, words that echoed in the empty places of the house and made the wallpaper seem closer to me than ever before. He promised that if I remained stubborn, they would cast me out into the street. They would make me leave the house that I had given them the right to live in. And he spoke that threat as if it were a victory to be celebrated. My heart stilled in that moment, a heavy, cold silence settling over me, but I did not cry out. I did not beg. I held Alex and I smoothed the dog's fur with trembling hands, pressing both small bodies to my chest, as if I could shelter them from the cruelty that had bloomed in the room. Rage and sorrow churned under my ribs, a hard, bitter thing like gravel, but I wore patience like armor because I had learned that daylight sometimes hides storms, and because I needed to be small for Alex, to not make him feel more afraid. When my son turned and stalked back into the house with his wife following, their laughter brittle with the triumph of those who think they have won, I felt something inside me change. I thought not of revenge in that instant, but of a slow, certain reckoning, a quiet knowledge that the scales of life tilt back in time. I told myself that I would survive this indignity, that I would keep my grandson close and tend the small life of the dog, and I promised myself that when the day came, their choices would circle back to them in ways they could not ignore. I closed the door behind me with the gentlest motion, not wanting to give them the satisfaction of hearing it slam. Outside, their laughter still echoed, brittle and mocking, a cruel reminder that they believed they had won. I leaned against the wooden frame for a moment, letting the weight of silence settle around me like a heavy blanket. My chest rose and fell in slow, shallow breaths as I fought the tears pressing at the corners of my eyes. I walked to the bed and sat down carefully on its edge, the mattress sinking under the memory of years. The fabric smelled faintly of lavender, a scent that reminded me of simpler times, of evenings when my husband still sat beside me with a book in hand. I closed my eyes, inhaling deeply, forcing myself to keep steady. Tears wanted to fall, but I would not let them. Crying here, now, would make me feel smaller, weaker, and I had already been made small enough in their presence. The lamp on the nightstand cast a dim glow across the room, soft and fragile. I stared at its circle of light before turning to the wooden drawer at my side. My hands hesitated over the handle, trembling as though I carried the weight of a secret too long concealed. Slowly I pulled it open, the sound of the wood scraping against itself filling the room like a whisper. Inside lay a bundle of documents, neatly bound, worn at the corners from years of handling in private. I placed them on my lap, smoothing the cover with care. For so long I had hidden this from them, tucked it away while pretending to be powerless, pretending to have nothing left but the mercy of their house. But here it was, the truth I had guarded in silence, the one thing they could not imagine. The papers seemed to glow under the lamp's dim light, a quiet promise that I was not as helpless as they believed. I traced the edges with my fingers, steadying myself, my breathing evening out as the storm outside my door continued. Their mocking voices could not reach me here. In this room with this secret, I reclaimed a part of myself. And for the first time in a long while, I did not feel broken. I felt patient, calculating, waiting. I whispered to myself that everything had its time, and mine was not yet gone. I placed the bundle of papers on my lap, my fingers trembling as I untied the worn ribbon that kept them together. The sound of the knot loosening seemed louder than the laughter outside my door. I drew a steady breath and unfolded the top document, the one I had kept hidden all this time. The ink had faded slightly, but the words remained sharp, undeniable. It was a copy of the house contract, carefully preserved by my lawyer, tucked away for the day I might need to remember who I truly was in this place. My eyes followed the lines of legal language until they landed on the part that mattered most. There, printed clearly in black and white, was my name written alongside my son's and his wife's. Equal, unshakable, bound by law. I traced the letters with my fingertip, as if to reassure myself that I was not imagining them. It was not sentiment or memory, not just a fragile story of sacrifice. It was fact. The house, worth $320,000, was not only theirs. It was mine too. Every wall, every window, every brick that I had poured my life into could not be stripped away by cruel words or mocking laughter. On paper, I was still a co-owner, and no amount of disdain could erase that truth. I leaned back against the headboard, the weight of humiliation shifting into something steadier, something colder. All this time they had mocked me, told me I was nothing, treated me like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. Yet here, in my hands, was proof that I still held ground under this roof. I was not powerless. I was not what they thought. The dim light from the lamp caught the edges of the paper, making it glow faintly, as if it were alive with its own quiet authority. I imagined the audience, those unseen witnesses to my pain, realizing the same truth I now held close. I was not empty-handed. I had not been stripped of everything. I folded the contract carefully, pressing it back into its folder with deliberate care. My hands no longer shook. Outside, their laughter carried on, but it no longer reached me in the same way. I whispered to myself that the day would come when these papers would speak louder than their cruelty. Until then, I would wait in silence, armed with the knowledge that I was not defeated. I reached deeper into the folder, past the contract, and pulled out another bundle of papers bound with a paperclip. My hands moved more steadily this time, guided by something firmer than fear. When I unfolded the sheets, the familiar numbers stared back at me. Bank statements, dated from years ago, some yellowed at the edges. These were from the account my husband and I had opened during the long days of running our little business together. Back then, every dollar earned felt like a small victory, every deposit a quiet promise that our hard work would build a safety net for the future. The account had been my secret for all these years. I never told my son, not once. I never mentioned it to friends or even to my closest relatives. To me, it was sacred, a lifeline that must remain hidden. I always called it my emergency fund, a reservoir of strength I could draw upon if life ever turned its back on me. And here it was, still intact, growing silently while the world outside thought I had nothing left. I ran my finger along the most recent balance, and my lips pressed together with something close to relief. The amount was not just a small cushion, it was enough to ensure that I would never be trapped, never be left at their mercy. It meant that no matter how cruel their words, no matter how sharp their laughter, I did not need to depend on them. I was not helpless. I thought of the nights spent counting receipts at the kitchen table with my husband, his hands steady as he recorded each sale, his voice calm as he told me to set something aside for the future. He believed in preparation, in strength through savings, and I honored that belief by guarding this account as carefully as my own heartbeat. Even after he was gone, I carried on the habit, depositing a little here and there, always protecting it from view. Now, in the dim glow of my room, I realized what this meant. They could threaten to cast me out. They could mock me as if I were living at their mercy. But I had my own foundation, one they could not touch. It was as though my husband's hand still rested on my shoulder, steadying me, reminding me that he had left me not only memories, but also the tools to survive. I closed the statements gently, folded them back into the file, and placed my palm over the folder. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself a small smile. Outside, their voices still carried on, careless and sharp, but inside me a quiet certainty had taken root. I was not dependent. I was not broken. I had the means to choose my own path, and that knowledge was power they could never take away. All this time, I had let them believe what they wanted. I allowed the whispers of weakness to cling to me, let their insults paint me as fragile, dependent, a woman too old to fight back. I had worn that mask of silence, endured the sting of their words, and bent beneath their cruelty, not because I was broken, but because I was waiting for the moment when truth would cut through pretense like light breaking into a dark room. Every tear I swallowed, every insult I endured, every time I looked away instead of answering, it was not surrender. It was patience, deliberate and measured. They thought my silence was emptiness, but in reality, it was observation. I had been watching, listening, storing away their every word and every action, not for the sake of revenge alone, but to see who they truly were when they believed I had nothing left. The accusations of being a burden, of living off their kindness, were lies I let them speak because I wanted to see how far they would go. The truth was that I had always stood on my own. The mask of dependence was mine to wear, a costume I accepted so I could hold the family together a little longer, to test whether love still lived in their hearts. Now, sitting in the quiet of my room with the documents spread before me, I felt the power I had kept hidden pulse steady and strong. My son and his wife saw only an old woman, vulnerable and clinging. What they did not see was the strength tucked beneath folded papers, the years of sacrifice turned into a foundation no insult could shake. For the first time, I no longer felt the sting of their mockery. I saw it for what it was, noise, shallow and fleeting. Behind their words, behind their cruelty, my truth waited. I was not the burden they claimed. I was the anchor of this house, the one who had built it, the one who still had the right to decide its future. From this moment forward, the audience can understand what I already knew deep within myself. The meekness had been an act, the silence a shield. My strength was never gone, only hidden. And now the waiting was nearly over. The time for endurance was passing, and the time for reckoning drew close. My heart beat steadily with the knowledge that the battle had not even begun, and when it did, it would not be me who trembled. I chose a morning when the house was quiet, when their eyes would not follow me. With my folder pressed close to my chest, I stepped out and walked toward the old office downtown. It had been years since I last came here, years since my husband and I sat across that polished oak desk discussing deeds and contracts. The door opened with the familiar chime, and for a moment I felt as though time had folded back on itself. The lawyer, now grayer than I remembered, greeted me warmly, with the respect of someone who had once known me not as a burden, but as a partner in business. I took a seat, my fingers still gripping the folder tightly, and then, with a steady motion, I laid the copy of the house contract on his desk. My voice, though low, did not waver. I asked him to review it carefully, to tell me exactly what rights still belonged to me. He adjusted his glasses, studied the papers, and the room filled with the soft sound of turning pages. Minutes stretched long, but I did not fidget. I sat upright, hands folded, waiting. When he finally looked up, his expression carried the weight of certainty. He told me plainly that my name on the contract was not symbolic. It meant ownership. It meant that I had every legal right to claim what was mine. Not only the roof and walls, but the original $320,000 could be pursued as debt, with interest accumulating from the day I signed it away. The words settled into me like iron. I was no longer just an old woman clinging to scraps of dignity. I was someone with standing, with a weapon forged not from anger but from law. My heart beat louder in my chest, not from fear but from a rising strength. This was the first time in so long that I had not been forced to swallow pain. Instead, I was holding something sharp and true, something that could not be silenced by mockery. The lawyer assured me he would support whatever course I chose. His tone was professional, but there was a flicker of admiration in his eyes, as though he saw in me not weakness but resolve. I gathered the documents, slid them back into the folder, and stood tall. As I left the office, the city outside seemed different. The air felt crisper, the sidewalks firmer beneath my feet. For the first time, I was not walking away in defeat. I was walking forward, armed with the law and the quiet knowledge that endurance was no longer my only weapon. I had taken the first step toward reclaiming what was mine. The lawyer slid a fresh sheet of paper across the desk, and for a moment I stared at it in silence. It felt heavier than paper should, as if it carried the weight of years of choices and betrayals. I opened my bag and took out the old will, the one my husband and I had drafted long ago, back when we still believed our son would honor our name. The ink on it was faded, the lines of inheritance still naming him and his wife as rightful heirs. Looking at it now, I felt a bitter pang. That trust had been shattered beyond repair. I told the lawyer I wanted to write it anew. My voice was calm, but firm in a way I had not heard from myself in years. I instructed him to remove every trace of my son and his wife from the inheritance. They would receive nothing, not the house, not the savings, not a single penny of what I had built with my husband's hands and my own sacrifices. For once, I was not the mother bending to forgive, but the woman standing to protect what mattered most. Instead, I named Alex. His small face flashed in my mind, his innocent arms wrapped around me when no one else would. I wanted him to have something real, a gift not tainted by the selfishness of his parents. But I added one condition: the inheritance would not pass through them. It would be managed by a legal guardian, one chosen to safeguard his future so that his parents' greed could not reach into his share. The rest, I decided, would not sit idly in a bank waiting for dust to settle. I signed it away to a charitable foundation for the elderly abandoned in their final years. Those whose children had turned their backs on them, those who sat alone in cold rooms with no hand to hold. my heart swelled with a sense of justice as I signed. It was more than revenge. It was a legacy. By cutting off my son and his wife, I was delivering a lesson. By giving to the forgotten, I was planting a seed of compassion that would outlive me. The lawyer nodded as he drafted the new clauses, his pen scratching steady and certain. When he pushed the papers back toward me, I lifted the pen and signed with a hand that no longer trembled. My name stretched across the page with the strength of finality. As I leaned back, I felt lighter, freer. The inheritance was no longer a chain binding me to betrayal. It had become a weapon, a shield, and a gift all at once. For Alex, for the abandoned, and for myself. The plan took shape quietly, as so many of my choices had in recent months. I knew that words alone would never be enough. They denied, twisted, and mocked every truth that passed my lips. But cameras did not lie. So I took a small portion of my hidden savings and purchased tiny devices, discreet and modern, no larger than the palm of my hand. I carried them home in silence, tucked away in a bag no one cared to notice. Late at night, when the house fell into uneasy sleep, I moved carefully through the rooms. My fingers placed the cameras in corners of the living room and along the hallway, hidden where only the walls themselves might know. My heart pounded as I adjusted their angles, the glow of the indicator light blinking once before vanishing into darkness. I whispered to myself that I was not betraying anyone. I was protecting myself, gathering the proof I needed when the time came to speak. Days passed, and the machines did their work without a sound. I carried on as if nothing had changed, folding laundry, preparing Alex's snacks, sitting quietly in the evenings while their cruelty unfurled. And then, one night, I watched the playback. The images cut sharper than any blade. My daughter-in-law's voice rang out, calling me a useless old woman, her face twisted with disdain as she hurled insult after insult. The camera did not flinch. It captured every word. Another recording showed my son stumbling home drunk, his eyes dull, his hands careless. The Yorkie wagged its tail, hopeful for affection, but instead received a shove so rough it tumbled out of sight. I felt my throat tighten as I watched. The child I had raised with care, now caught in a moment of brutality that stripped away all the excuses I had once made for him. I gathered the memory cards with trembling hands and placed them in a small box. The next morning I walked once more to the lawyer's office, carrying the weight of truth in my bag. I laid the evidence on his desk, one piece after another, the screen flickering with undeniable proof. His eyes grew solemn as he nodded, promising to build the legal case that would hold them accountable. For the first time, I felt that I was no longer the only witness to my suffering. The walls had seen, the cameras had listened, and now the law would know. I was no longer alone. That morning, I rose before the sun. The house still slept, thick with silence, and I moved like a shadow through my room. I opened the small closet and chose only a few clothes, folding them neatly into a worn suitcase. Into a second bag I placed the documents I had guarded so carefully, the papers that held more strength than any weapon. My hands lingered over the dresser one last time before I closed it. There was nothing else I needed from this place. I did not announce my departure. I did not leave notes or explanations. With steady steps, I walked down the hallway, past the rooms where their laughter had once cut me open. The front door closed softly behind me, not with anger, but with resolve. By noon, I had signed the lease for a small apartment across town. It was modest, nothing like the grand house I had left, but it welcomed me with its simplicity. The rooms were clean, the windows let in warm light, and the air felt free. For the first time in years, I sat on a chair in silence and felt peace rather than humiliation. A pot of flowers on the sill made the space softer, and I promised myself I would fill it with small joys that no cruelty could touch. Back in the old house, I knew what they must be saying. My son and his wife would see my absence as surrender, a retreat born of shame. They would likely celebrate, perhaps with a cruel smile, convinced they had finally pushed me out, convinced that victory was theirs. Let them believe it. Let them taste that hollow triumph. Because I knew the truth. And so did the silent witness of every viewer. This was not defeat. This was strategy. I had stepped away not to vanish, but to prepare. Every move I made now was part of something larger, something carefully built from patience and pain. The papers, the recordings, the plans with my lawyer, these were my true companions, and they waited quietly for the right moment. As I unpacked the last of my clothes and placed them into drawers, I felt the calm of someone who finally held control of her own story. The battle had not yet begun, but I was no longer a prisoner in their house. I had turned retreat into strength, silence into a weapon, and in that quiet apartment, surrounded by stillness, I told myself that the final reckoning was not far away. That evening, the street outside their house was unusually alive. Neighbors peeked from porches and windows as two figures stepped up to the front gate: my lawyer, calm and deliberate, and two uniformed officers whose presence made the air heavy. I followed a step behind, my heart steady, no longer trembling as it once did. The front door swung open, and for the first time in years, it was not me who carried shame across the threshold. We entered the living room where my son and his wife sat, startled by the sight of official papers in the lawyer's hands. He cleared his throat, his voice firm enough for every ear in the room and beyond the walls. First, he read the new will. He declared that all assets were no longer destined for the son or the daughter-in-law, that their names had been struck out entirely. The words fell like stones, echoing even outside, where curious neighbors gathered. Next came the house documents. The lawyer laid them flat on the table, pointing to the lines of ownership, reminding them that I had every right to demand repayment of the original $320,000, complete with accumulated interest. The truth, which they had mocked me for forgetting, was now undeniable. And then, the evidence. Screens displayed the cruelest moments. My son, drunk and staggering, shoving the Yorkie out as if it were trash. My daughter-in-law's face twisted with scorn as she hurled insults, calling me a useless old woman. The scenes of neglect when Alex was left hungry and alone. The cameras had seen everything, and now so did the law. My son stood frozen, his face drained of color, lips pressed tight as if words had abandoned him. My daughter-in-law broke first, her voice high-pitched, tears smearing down her cheeks while her fingernails, still painted half-finished, scratched at her sleeve. The officers stepped closer, their questions sharp, and she crumbled under the weight of her own cruelty. Around us, whispers rose from the neighbors who had come to watch. Their eyes, once indifferent, now burned with judgment. The humiliation they had forced on me in private now returned to them in public. And in that silence, I felt a tug at my arm. Alex ran to me, his small body slamming against mine in an embrace that nearly knocked me off balance. His little arms clung tight, his cheek pressed against my chest. I bent down and held him close, one hand resting on his hair, the other steadying the trembling dog in my arms. The voices around me faded, and for a moment it was only the three of us: me, my grandson, and the small life we had protected together. The crowd might have seen punishment, but what I felt was something deeper: the return of dignity, the quiet proof that love and truth still had a place in this world. The courtroom was hushed when the first video played on the screen. Faces leaned forward, eyes narrowing as the harsh voice of my daughter-in-law filled the room. There she was, captured in cold clarity, her mouth twisted with contempt as she hurled insults at me, calling me useless, dismissing me as though I were less than human. Another clip followed, showing her brushing past Alex, ignoring his cries while she painted her nails, her indifference as sharp as any blade. And then came the sight of her pushing the Yorkie aside, her hand rough, her tone dripping with disgust. Gasps echoed through the chamber. The evidence was undeniable, every frame more damning than the last. My lawyer stood tall beside me, his voice calm as he reminded the judge that these were not isolated incidents, but patterns of cruelty. The weight of the truth pressed down on her like chains she could not escape. Within days, the local media carried the story. Photographs of her once polished face now appeared alongside headlines about neglect and abuse. The neighbors, who had once smiled politely, now whispered openly in the streets, shaking their heads as her name became a warning rather than a boast. Her glittering reputation dissolved, leaving behind only shame. When the verdict was read, the room seemed to hold its breath. The judge declared her guilty of elder abuse and cruelty to animals. The sentence was clear: mandatory community service, public restitution, and financial compensation. No longer could she hide behind fine clothes or painted nails. The law had stripped away her pretense. I watched her bow her head, her once proud shoulders hunched as the sentence was delivered. The woman who had flaunted wealth and status now stood exposed, her pride crumbling under the weight of justice. In that moment, I did not feel triumph, but a somber recognition that cruelty carries its own price. When she returned to the neighborhood, people no longer greeted her with admiration. They turned away, their conversations dipping into whispers. The distance between her and the world she once sought to impress grew wider each day. From someone who had strutted with arrogance, she became a figure avoided, pitied, and scorned. For me, it was not revenge alone. It was the restoration of dignity, the truth laid bare for all to see. She had carved her own downfall, and now the community saw her as she truly was. When the lawyer dug deeper into the finances, the truth came spilling out like rot from a cracked wall. Every bet, every reckless wager on football games was laid bare. Pages of records, receipts, and transfers told the story of a man who had gambled away not only his money, but also his dignity. The numbers climbed into the tens of thousands, a mountain of debt piled on promises he could never keep. What he had once hidden behind closed doors now stood exposed in the light of day. Without the house to shield him, he was stripped of his last illusion of security. Creditors began circling, their letters sharp and merciless, their demands impossible to ignore. The prospect of personal bankruptcy loomed closer with each passing week, the walls of his false pride closing in. He could no longer pretend to be the master of the household when his own finances betrayed him at every turn. And then the new will was read in front of witnesses. His name was absent, erased as though it had never belonged there. No inheritance, no share of the wealth, nothing to cling to when the storm came crashing down. The lawyer's voice was calm as he confirmed it, but the meaning struck like a hammer. He had been cut out completely. I watched from my seat, silent, my face unreadable. Once I might have wept at such a fall. Once I might have rushed to rescue him, to cover his debts as mothers often do. But that time was gone. He had mocked me, scorned me, treated me as though I were less than nothing. Now he faced the truth of his own making. The man who once sneered at my frugality, who once accused me of wasting money on flowers or food, now stood hollow with no fortune, no inheritance, and no future but the long shadow of debt. His arrogance dissolved into shame, his pride replaced by the humiliation of being known as nothing more than a gambler who had lost it all. Neighbors who had once greeted him with respect now whispered as he passed. The same community that watched him ignore me now watched him unravel. His name no longer carried authority, it carried disgrace. And so, the son who had treated his mother as a burden stood at last with nothing left but the weight of his own failures. Unlocked the door of the new apartment and stepped inside, carrying only what I truly needed. The space was small, but the air felt light, untouched by resentment. I placed a vase of fresh flowers on the table, arranged the curtains the way I liked, and set a pot of tea to warm on the stove. For the first time in many years, every corner belonged to me. There were no voices barking orders, no footsteps heavy with anger, only the quiet rhythm of a home shaped by my own hands. The settlement had come through. The money I had once thought lost, the $320,000 plus the interest it had grown, was finally restored to me. I looked at the figures in my bank book and felt no urge to hoard them. Instead, I went to the lawyer and made the choice I had carried in my heart for so long. I created a foundation to serve the elderly who had been abandoned, those left to face their final days without family or kindness. It felt like planting seeds in barren soil, a way to turn my pain into something that could blossom for others. In the evenings, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the city lights flicker like distant stars. Meals were no longer battles, they were simple plates of food seasoned with peace. I no longer flinched at the sound of raised voices, no longer felt the weight of being unwanted in my own home. The walls did not echo with scorn anymore. They held only the soft hum of a life reclaimed. Sometimes Alex would visit, his laughter filling the rooms, and Yorkie curled up happily at my feet. Those moments reminded me that love had survived the storm. I had not lost everything after all. I had gained freedom, dignity, and the strength to stand in my own light. To anyone watching, it might have looked like a story about money, losses, debts, and inheritance. But the truth was deeper. This was not about wealth. It was about dignity, about reclaiming what cruelty had tried to strip away. My victory was not counted in dollars, but in the silence of peace, the freedom of my own space, and the knowledge that I could still give back to the world. And so, in that modest apartment, surrounded by simplicity, I finally breathed without fear. It was not defeat that defined me, nor revenge, but the quiet triumph of dignity restored. Every weekend, without fail, I heard the sound of small footsteps racing down the hallway of my apartment. Before I could rise from my chair, Alex would burst through the door, his arms flinging around me, his laughter spilling into the room like sunlight. He smelled of crayons and playground dust, and I held him close, pressing my cheek to the crown of his head as though he were the anchor of my days. Behind him came the familiar shuffle of Yorkie, tail wagging furiously, circling us with excited barks as if to remind the world that loyalty still existed. Those visits became the heart of my new life. We planted flowers together on the balcony, tiny pots of daisies, tulips, and lavender. Alex's small hands dug into the soil with determination, while Yorkie watched, pawing curiously at the dirt. Sometimes we laughed until tears filled our eyes, dirt smudging our cheeks, the air rich with the scent of fresh earth and promise. It felt like building something sacred, a small family bound not by circumstance, but by love freely given. In the kitchen, we cooked simple meals. Alex stood on a stool, stirring batter with exaggerated seriousness while I guided his hands. Yorkie sat at our feet, hoping for crumbs to fall. The meals were never perfect. Pancakes sometimes burned, pasta sometimes overcooked, but they were filled with laughter, and that was nourishment enough. The table, once a place of silence and cruelty, was now a circle of warmth and joy. When night fell, Alex curled up with Yorkie on the couch, his head resting on the little dog's back. I sat nearby, knitting or reading, my heart swelling as I watched them breathe in unison. In those quiet hours, I felt something I had long thought lost: the safety of belonging, the peace of being loved without condition. The world outside still whispered about justice and punishment, about downfall and disgrace. My son and his wife were spoken of with pity or contempt, their names carrying the weight of their own choices. But none of that mattered in my small apartment, where love had taken root again. For the viewers of this story, the ending was clear. Evil had consumed itself, cruelty had met its consequences, and those who had sown pain now lived with their harvest. Yet here in this modest home, goodness had flourished. The bond between a grandmother, her grandson, and a small faithful dog stood as proof that love endures even when tested by betrayal. And so the story closed not with bitterness, but with the quiet triumph of dignity, compassion, and peace reclaimed. The garden was quiet that afternoon, touched by the soft glow of the fading sun. I sat on a wooden bench, the cushions warm beneath me, while Alex nestled at my side, his small hand resting in mine. Yorkie lay at our feet, breathing softly, the rise and fall of his chest a steady rhythm against the hush of the evening. Around us, flowers we had planted together swayed gently in the breeze, their colors rich, their petals unfolding like little promises of tomorrow. Alex looked up at me, his eyes wide and thoughtful, the kind of look that told me he understood more than his years allowed. He leaned his head against my arm, and in that moment, I felt the circle of life settle into its rightful place. Pain had given way to strength, betrayal had yielded to peace. The scene lingered, simple yet full. A grandmother, a grandson, and a faithful dog beneath the sky, surrounded by the life they had chosen to grow. No mansion, no riches, no false pride, only love, dignity, and the quiet victory of survival. And as the camera of life seemed to pull back, the message became clear. This story was never about losing or gaining money. It was about reclaiming the right to live with honor, about finding joy in what cannot be stolen. To everyone who hears this story, let it remind you that dignity is more powerful than cruelty, that patience can outlast betrayal, and that kindness, no matter how small, plants roots that endure beyond pain. Do not measure your worth by what others take from you. Measure it by what you still have the courage to give. Because in the end, justice is not a shout of anger, but the quiet strength of those who refuse to be broken.